Hello and welcome to another edition of News for English Learners. My name's Jim. I'm an English teacher and I'll be helping you to understand some of the interesting words and phrases that we come across as we read a news article together. This week's news article is about how certain countries that were once colonized by others are demanding the return of cultural items or items of cultural significance. In this case, we're talking about the African country of Ghana, which is seeking the return of its stolen crown jewels. However, this case is really the tip of the iceberg. There are many other countries around the world who are seeking similar restitution. So let's begin with the first paragraph. The UK has agreed to loan back some of the most precious items of Ghana's cultural heritage 150 years after they were taken from the court of the Asante king. The 32 pieces of Asante gold, which are considered to be the equivalent of our crown jewels by the director of the Victoria and Albert Museum, will be handed over to the current Asante king for 3 years, with the possibility of extending the deal for another 3 years. The items were looted by British forces during the 19th century wars between the British and the Asante. The Asante, also known as the Ashanti, are a people who ruled over a large part of modern-day Ghana between the 1700s and 1900s. So the first phrase we have highlighted here is to loan back. This is a verb phrase, and this is concerning the act of either borrowing or lending something. Now, these two verbs, lend and borrow, they often generate some confusion because they are essentially talking about the same action but from a different perspective. Really, the easiest way to think about this is to think about two other verbs, give and take, right? Now, if I give a gift to somebody, they automatically take that gift. It's the same action, but viewed from a different perspective. And similarly, if I lend an object to somebody, they automatically borrow it from me. The difference between give and take and lend and borrow is that when we lend something or we borrow it, this is a temporary action. So you have to give it back, or at least you should, in theory, return it. And that is in fact what is happening here. The UK has agreed to lend or to loan back some of the most precious items of Ghana's cultural heritage, but in principle it is temporary. They're not permanently returning those objects. It is only a loan. So as we see here, the word loan, as well as being a verb, is also a noun. So a loan can be, for example, an amount of money that you borrow from the bank. If I want to set up a business and I don't have enough cash available, one option is to go to the bank and ask for a loan. It is an amount of money that I will have to return. I will have to pay it back. So the bank lends me that money. I use it to set up the business. And then when I start making a profit, hopefully, I will pay back that money to the bank. So that is a loan. Moving on to the second word we have here, it is the noun heritage. This is related to the verb inherit. So when we inherit something, that essentially means that we gain possession of that. And it could be money or it could be assets. And this most commonly happens when people die, when parents or grandparents or other relatives die, and they have left something, as I said, either cash or assets in their will. That is a written document which specifies who should inherit their assets and cash. So let's say, for example, that my grandfather died and he had a house. He might decide to divide the ownership of that house between his children or his grandchildren. So if that includes me, I would inherit part of the value of that house. Heritage in this case refers to cultural heritage. So this is, in effect, the items, perhaps sacred items or valuable items, objects, that have been passed down through the generations from ancestors. In this case, we're talking about Ghana's crown jewels. So these have existed presumably for many years, and they have been passed down the generations. They've been inherited by the current generation of the royal family. This is part of their cultural heritage or inheritance. Moving on to the third word, we have a phrasal verb here, to hand over. Now, the verb hand is often used as a phrasal verb, and it actually has several different combinations. You can hand something in, you can hand it over, as we have in this case. You can hand something out. Basically, the meaning is quite similar in each case, but the usage is slightly different. So if you are handing something out, it means you are standing perhaps in the street and you are perhaps passing information, leaflets or flyers, to anybody who walks past you. So it's kind of similar to distributing something. Equally, if you're on an airplane, the cabin crew will walk along the aisle and they will hand out food and drinks. Handover is slightly different. It means that you are basically giving something to somebody. You're passing it over to their custody, if you like. Maybe the police have cornered a armed robber and they demand that he hand over his weapon. Or perhaps a robber, street robber, has threatened somebody in the street and he demands that the victim hands over their money. So it is that act of passing over an object to somebody specific. In this case, obviously, the museum is passing those crown jewels over to the current Asante king. Hand in, which was the other one I mentioned, is usually used in the context of perhaps education. For example, if I'm working on a project and I have to finish it before a deadline, I would hand it in to the teacher, hopefully before that deadline. So the next word we have here is loot, or looted in this case. This is a regular verb, as we see, but can also be used as a noun. As a noun, it refers to items of value that have been stolen. Often it's used to refer to things taken during times of war or conflict. An example of this could be when the Vikings invaded or attacked parts of Britain during the 8th and 9th century. They were notorious for pillaging and looting. So that means whenever they came across something valuable, they would steal that. They would take it with them. And equally, as we see here, the British did a very similar thing during their colonial period. They conquered a country. They would often take anything that was considered valuable. So therefore, we see that the verb to loot is essentially the same as the noun. The noun refers to things that are stolen, and the verb refers to the act of stealing or taking something that doesn't belong to you. So the next word we have here is to rule over. And this word rule has a couple of different meanings. It is often used when we talk about the way we must behave or the way that we must do something. Think about the rules of a game. If you're playing a game with somebody, you should follow the rules. Those are the instructions about how to play that game. If you break the rules, then we sometimes call that cheating. Of course, there are rules in society in general too. There are social rules, rules of behavior that govern how we behave in society. And there are stronger rules which we consider to be laws. And if you break those, then there will be very severe consequences. As a verb, however, this usually refers to the act of governing or controlling a particular area. In the case of modern states, it is the government that rules the country. They're in charge of the country, they pass laws and enforce those laws. But in other periods, for example, when states didn't really exist, there were tribes or groups of people that shared a common culture that would rule over a particular area. And that doesn't necessarily correspond with the modern states. So in this case, it was the Ashanti or Asante that ruled over or were in charge of a large part of the land that corresponds roughly to the modern day area of the state of Ghana. So let's move on to the next paragraph. The deal is seen as a historic step towards addressing the issue of restitution of stolen or looted artifacts from European museums. Many countries have been demanding the return of their cultural heritage, which was taken during colonial times or military campaigns. However, some national museums in the UK, such as the British Museum and the V&A, are prohibited by law from permanently giving back such items. However, some critics have argued that accepting items on loan could be seen as acknowledging that Britain has ownership over them. They have also wondered whether loan deals are sufficient to address the historical injustices and inequalities that resulted from colonialism and imperialism. So, moving to the first word in this paragraph, we have restitution. This is a noun, and in law, this refers to the payment of compensation for damages to individuals or organizations. So, if a company is found to be liable for damage or harm to a particular person, they would usually be forced to pay restitution, to pay an amount of money to compensate for that harm. Now, in this case, we are talking about the issue of returning objects, not paying money. But the idea is quite similar here, that you are in some way compensating for previous harms. You're giving back items that were stolen or looted previously. So let's move on to the next word. We have the phrasal verb give back. And this is something I mentioned before when I was talking about borrowing and lending. I told you that if you borrow something from somebody, like perhaps you don't have a particular tool, let's say a hammer, and you need one, maybe you borrow it from your neighbor, then your neighbor would expect you to return that or to give it back when you have finished using it. So we see that give back is a separable phrasal verb. That means you can put the object in the middle between the verb and the noun. You give the hammer back, or you put it after the particle. You give back the hammer. Pay attention though, because if you use a pronoun, in this case it has to go in the middle. So you give it back. The next word we have here is the regular verb to argue. This sometimes generates a little confusion because it can be used in a couple of different ways. In one sense, if you are arguing with another person, that means you are having a very strong verbal disagreement with them. Often that involves shouting and getting angry. So if I'm listening to my neighbors arguing, probably they will be making a lot of noise and they will be shouting at each other, usually because of some very strong disagreement. Another way of saying that is to row. So they could be having a row or they're rowing. Or in fact, we also use the verb to quarrel. They're quarreling or having a quarrel. However, in this sense, the verb argue is used in a more academic way. So if you are arguing for or against a particular action, that means you are giving supporting arguments or reasons for a particular course of action. So it doesn't involve getting angry. It's the basic difference. You are kind of listing the pros and cons and supporting reasons for taking a particular course of action. In this case, some critics of this policy have suggested that the act of accepting the items on loan could be problematic for those countries because it may make it more difficult for them to gain the objects permanently. It may seem that they are giving up their right to own those objects. So that is their argument in this case. That is what they are saying or suggesting. So let's move on to the next word. This is acknowledging, to acknowledge. It's a regular verb, so acknowledged in the past. Acknowledgement is the abstract noun. So when you acknowledge something, essentially you are recognizing its existence. You are saying that it exists or it is true. If you have made a mistake, it's better that you acknowledge that mistake, that you recognize it and admit it, and then you can deal with it. A case from history recent history would be when Donald Trump, the ex-president of the United States, refused to acknowledge or to accept the result of the election when he lost the last election. He denied that fact. He didn't acknowledge it and continued to deny it until, of course, there was terrible consequences when we saw the rioting at Congress. It is also sometimes used when you are acknowledging the receipt of something. So you are recognizing the fact that you have received it. Perhaps it's an important email or an important letter or package that you have sent, and you want the recipient to acknowledge when they have actually received it. So they just send you a message back saying, yes, I have received it. That's an acknowledgement as well. In this case, of course, the problem is that it could be seen, the act of lending these items back to the original countries could be seen as an acceptance of Britain's ownership in a way. So that is the essential problem here. Finally, in this paragraph, we have the word whether. Now, this is a homophone, so it sounds exactly the same as the other word, weather, which is spelled W-E-A-T-H-E-R. Now, that weather refers to the wind and the rain and the sun, the atmospheric conditions. This weather is very different. This one is actually very similar to another word, which is if. So we often use whether in cases where there is a doubt. So imagine I don't know whether to stay at home and watch a movie on Netflix or go out to the cinema. I have that doubt. There are two options there. So we often use it in those cases. And here we also have a doubt, right? Because those critics are wondering, they're thinking whether these kind of loan deals are enough, whether they are sufficient to address these historical injustices. Is it enough or not? That is the doubt here. So we often use it in those cases. You often see it before an infinitive, whether to do something or not, whether to take one course of action or another. But essentially, it is very similar to the word if. However, it's not used in all cases where we use if. So, for example, in a conditional, where we start with if, we would not use whether. For example, second conditional, if I won the lottery, I would buy a new house. We cannot use whether in this case. So be careful with the usage of it. So let's move on to the final paragraph. One of the most controversial cases of restitution is that of the Parthenon marbles, which were taken from Greece by Lord Elgin in the early 19th century and are now displayed at the British Museum. Greece has been campaigning for their return for decades, but the British Museum has refused to do so, claiming that they are part of a universal museum that benefits humanity. A spokesperson for Ghana said that he hoped the deal would bring a new sense of cultural cooperation following years of anger. He also said that he hoped that other countries would follow suit and return their looted artifacts. "We are happy that our gold is coming back home," he said. "We hope this will open up a new chapter in our relationship with Britain and other European countries that have our treasures." So let's turn to the first word now. We have this adjective, controversial. The noun is controversy. When we are talking about something that is controversial, essentially we are talking about something that has a lot of disagreement. It's kind of divides society. There are many cases of things being controversial throughout history. One that springs to mind that caused cultural controversy in my own country during I think it was the 1970s when it was released, was a film called The Life of Brian, which was created by a group of comedians called Monty Python. And the reason it was controversial is because it dealt with themes related to religion. And in my opinion, it's an amazing film, incredibly funny, but some people of a religious persuasion took offense to its message. They didn't really understand it, I think, was the problem. But it was controversial. It generated a lot of anger and bad feeling. Another example of something that was controversial at the time was the theory of evolution, which was devised principally by Charles Darwin, although of course there were other scientists working on it at the time, but he's the one who's recognized after his publication of his book on the origin of species. And that book became very controversial, again, largely amongst religious people, basically because it challenged their authority, and they strongly disagreed with it for many years. In fact, in the United States, it still remains controversial in some areas where deeply religious institutions and people still don't admit that the evidence is strong for evolution. In this case, it is referring to one of the most famous episodes of this kind of looting, which took place, as we see here, in the 19th century, at a time when the British were in Greece during a time of political turmoil, and a particular person called Lord Elgin decided he was going to remove marbles from the Parthenon monument in Greece and transport them back to Britain. And they've been there ever since, displayed in the British Museum. Well, for many years, let's say, for many decades, Greece has been demanding that those Parthenon marbles are returned to their original location. In fact, they have even built a very expensive museum, so everything is ready for them to be displayed, but they have not been able to reach an agreement because of the fact that the British Museum refuses to return them. In fact, is prevented from doing so by law. So this is very controversial. Many people think that the British Museum should return those marbles which were stolen, but other people think that they should not be. There's no agreement here. There's controversy. Moving on to the next word, we have campaigning. So the verb is campaign. This is a regular verb. We can talk about an advertising campaign. So this is when a particular company or brand wants to promote its product. So it launches a campaign. It's a concerted set of adverts that perhaps use different media in order to try to promote their product. So a campaign is kind of like a plan of action and a procedure with a particular objective. In the case of advertising, the objective is to sell more product. In the case of a political campaign, the objective is to win votes and eventually win an election. So we often see this word used in the realm of politics. When politicians are out campaigning for election, they are going from door to door, meeting people, explaining their policies, and trying to persuade them or convince them to vote for them or for their party. In this case, the campaign has been undertaken by Greece. So they have taken various actions, have had many kind of meetings, and tried their best to persuade the British government to return their stolen artifacts. And unfortunately for them, this campaign has not been successful so far. Moving on to the penultimate word, we have this phrase to follow suit. To follow suit. Now, suit is an interesting word because it has several different meanings. As a noun, a suit can be something you wear for formal occasions. For example, if you're having a job interview, you might put on a suit. That means you wear a shirt and a tie and a jacket and smart trousers. It can also be used as a verb. If I say that something suits you, it means it looks good on you. A particular style of clothes. Maybe you're out shopping and you try something on and you say, "What do you think? Does it look good?" And I say, "Yeah, that really suits you." But perhaps a particular color actually suits you. It looks good on you. Similarly, we use the adjective suitable when something is apt or appropriate for a particular cause or situation. And in this case, the suit in question, I think, refers to the suits that we find on cards. So if you've ever played a game of cards using the poker cards, you know that there are 4 suits. There are diamonds, clubs, hearts, and spades, each represented by a different symbol. So each of those is called a suit. Now, when you play certain games, if I play, let's say, 10 of spades, you, the next player, may also have to play a card of the same suit. So you have to follow suit in that respect. You have to do the same thing that I've done, or similar thing. So that is the sense in which this is used here. If you're following suit, it essentially means you're copying somebody else's actions. Now, an example of this could be in business, perhaps, in price competition, where there's intense competition between different companies over selling products. If one of the companies reduces their prices, the others may also follow suit if they can, in order to gain customers. In the article here, we are talking about the hopes of the Ghanaian government that other governments would follow suit. They would follow the lead of the British and perhaps also return artifacts that were looted previously. So moving on to the last phrase here, we have to open up a new chapter. This is an idiomatic phrase. We're not actually talking about chapters in a book here, but it is similar to another phrase, which is to turn over a new leaf. In that phrase, leaf refers to the page of a book, so it is kind of related to chapters as well. When you turn over a new leaf, you start afresh, you begin again. And when you open up a new chapter in your life, let's say, that essentially means you are beginning a new part of your life story, right? Just like the chapters in a book often differ from each other, this episode or this period of your life may be significantly different from what went before, and indeed from what may happen in the future. So it's kind of like a new beginning, a fresh start. That is the sense it's used here. They hope that this change in attitude perhaps is the beginning of something new. It may encourage other museums around the world to copy that action, and we'll have to obviously wait and see what happens. So there we have it. That's the end of today's article. I hope you found it interesting and perhaps have come across a few new words and phrases. Don't forget to check out some of my other videos. There's quite a few now, I think more than 25, and containing a lot of different words and phrases. The actual complete list of all the words and phrases is available in the video description. If you want to download that, you'll be able to locate a particular word in a particular video. And each video is divided into chapters, so it makes it easier to skip parts if you're just interested in certain words. So, of course, if you've liked it, don't forget to click like and subscribe. I really appreciate it if you do that. It really encourages me to make more videos for you. So thank you, and until next time, goodbye.